Right. So let's start. So thank you very much, Konrad, Aureo, and Mingli for your time, and it's pleasure to have you to have you with us here. So Konrad will present central limit theory for models of strategic network formation, and so that will be 1 hour. And this is again, we are recording this this presentation, so you can, if you wish, ask your question in the chat, and we can read it on your behalf, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. And there is one little thing, please, little announcement about next week's seminar. So we had a cancellation, so the next speaker should be Giovanni Amisando, but he canceled, and but we managed to replace him by, so Bin Wong will be presenting. Bin Wong from Monash University will be presenting a correction for misspecification in trend cycle decompositions with an application to estimating R star. And the discussant will be Sid Zaman from Cleveland Federal Reserve. So the floor is yours, Konrad, and thank you very much again, everyone. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Abderrahim, for inviting me to speak in this series. Just upfront, feel free to ask questions anytime. Also, if there are like any issues like seeing the slides or understanding me, please let me know right away. So just to kind of front load the disappointing news, so this is not a time series paper. This is T is equal to 1, but it is about dependence. And so the structure of dependence here is going to be symmetric. So kind of as a topical model of dependence, you can think in terms of exchangeability. Okay, so the purpose of this paper is to find tractable characterizations of models of network formation. So we here the network that we observe is like we think of it as a static snapshot where agents take discrete decisions whether or not to form a link. So this is kind of a large-scale discrete choice model with like many options and many agents and with strategic interactions. So and that kind of creates the issue, both the complexity of the model as well as statistical stochastic dependence. So in principle, one could think of this model as just a discrete action finite player game, and we could write down like all the possible payoff inequalities for the observable outcome to be in equilibrium. And so one could realistically do that for like, maybe a game of 3 or 4 agents going to a network with like 8, 10, 15 agents. This becomes like incredibly hard. And then, 20, 25 agents, near impossible. And so kind of the approach taken here is to say, well, how about we don't just go to 25 agents, but we go to 1,000 agents, 5,000 agents, and then we use stochastic approximations to certain aspects of the finite player model to find a limit model that has a simpler structure. So kind of the game plan overall is to embed our finite player network formation model into an asymptotic sequence and then justify a simpler model as an approximation that becomes better and better as the network grows larger. And so I'll go into detail more like how I construct the particular family of sequences of models that we'll consider here. And so kind of the strategic interdependencies between the links, they're kind of what makes the problem complicated, but also interesting. Like that's why we think of, say, a combination, like a system of transactions or relationships, economic or social, as a network rather than just like an unrelated, like a collection of unrelated bilateral relationships. And so much of what I want to do is also motivated by now like a very rich applied theory literature that looks at various local motives for being strategic about who you want to connect to, and use those to predict like general patterns in observable networks that are like relative to a standard random graph model. So one example would be an information network. So the role here of the network is to transmit information about the state of nature or job offers or some other relevant information. And so the question is, who should I link to in this network? There's some cost of maintaining a relationship, a link, but depending on how exactly information travels through the network and whether it's rival or not, it may either be better to connect to more central agents in the network and therefore kind of scan like a broader subset of the network efficiently, or to link to less central nodes if information is rival, because then everybody else will have access to that same information. Another example is like if the network is consists of like upstream, downstream trading relationships. So you have essentially bilateral bargaining power at the level of pairs of nodes, and that bargaining power relative to other components of the network is stronger. It's like that is stronger if there's like no other link bypassing it. And so there are also papers by a theoretical paper by Mihai Manea and an empirical paper by Robin Lee and Tina Fong, and by now more that look at that motive. Right. Another possibility is that, especially if we think of network links as like risky transactions with some element of asymmetric information, then there's often like a motive to include third parties that can help with screening, monitoring, or exposed enforcement. And so usually those types of network or those types of motives give rise to clustering that would be in excess of what a standard random graph model would predict. So in each of these cases, we can kind of think of a strategic motive in a theory that where like link payoffs or some continuation payoff for economic activity that will take place on the network once it's formed. And each of those theories is kind of like a way you write down the most elegant model that delivers like an effect in terms of the impact of that motive on the general structure of the network. Like you see like certain patterns in the network. Now, if you want to empirically validate whether those hypothesized motives, whether they are actually relevant, then we also have to allow for a model that's richer, that allows us to control for covariates, for example. Like it could just be, we could just see excessive clustering because agents are close to each other in terms of some underlying covariates. Like say agents are located in space and you're more likely linked to somebody who's close to you. Okay, so now I'm just going to give some basic notation for the setup. So I'm going to obviously restrict myself to a special, relevant like case of the model. So I'm going to focus on undirected networks where links are unweighted. So think of a link as being 0 or 1, depending on whether it's present or not. So that's the variable Lij. The network being undirected means that Lij is equal to Lji. So the adjacency matrix is an n times n matrix of those link indicators, and in an undirected network, it's symmetric. And nodes are also associated with observable attributes, which we take as exogenous. They're relevant for network formation, so link preferences will be allowed to depend on those characteristics as well. And so just like as a convenient notational device, it's like often helpful to think of features of the network incrementally by, effects on or payoff changes if I just cut one of the links or I add one of the links. So this notation, capital L is the adjacency, n times n adjacency matrix, minus ij is the adjacency matrix I get from setting the link ij and ji equal to 0, right? And L plus ij is the adjacency matrix from setting that link to 1. Of course, in L, the link is either 0 or 1. So one of the two is just equal to L itself. And then to specify link payoffs, I broadly think of the payoff as the overall value to agent I of the network having a certain structure, having a certain form. Here, the index I also subsumes dependence on attributes of node I. And at this level, without additional restrictions, splitting the overall payoff into some component that we call benefits and some components that we call costs is kind of tautological, because only the difference is like relevant for any incentives. But we will, on the next slide, impose some structure on that. And so we specify, and kind of also along with the econometric literature on network formation, we specify payoffs in terms of payoff increments as we add a specific other link, right? And so the ij subscript here also indicates that these payoff increments may depend on attributes of agent I, agent J, the relative or absolute position of agents I and J in the network. Okay, and so we do the same thing for on the cost side, marginal cost. And so once we specify those payoffs, I'm essentially going to assume that anything that's specific to link I and J is like subsumed under on the benefit side, and that costs are heterogeneous across I, but they are don't depend on the identity of the alter. Okay, and so given the payoffs, we need to close the model by making defining a solution concept. So the solution concept I use here is pairwise stability. So a network is, like, broadly speaking, pairwise stable if we have a link between I and J, if and only if both sides agree to it. Okay, if either I or J prefers not to have that link, then that link cannot form. Okay, but then the payoffs here, they still depend on L star. They still depend on the rest, the structure of the remainder of the network. And so that's where the strategic interaction effects come in, where they operate. And so in general, you need some structure on the payoffs to ensure that a pairwise stable network is guaranteed to exist. Pairwise stable networks are generally not unique. So we can think of a solution concept that's kind of imposes like a stronger notion of rationality than pairwise stability. For example, an agent could, this only considers deviations by a single link. So if I'm agent I only look at the link to J in isolation from everything else. We could have an agent that realizes, well, if I switch my links to J, K, and L at the same time, I might actually have an increase in overall network payoff, even though each individual change would on its own not be advantageous. And so since the asymptotic experiment considers a network that increases in size, we should also make sure that the solution concept doesn't like impose too high of a burden of rationality and on the agents. So pairwise stable networks could be rationalized as fixed points of like a myopic adjustment tâtonnement process, where you initialize the network at like some arbitrary initial state, and then agents just adjust like one link at a time if it's advantageous or not. And then if that process stops, the resulting network must be pairwise stable. So in that case, like the agents don't need to have a good global understanding of the structure of the net. They don't have to be overly sophisticated, and we could still see networks that satisfy pairwise stability. So in general, though, we also have to deal with multiplicity. So the way I do it in this paper, this is slightly stronger than or much stronger than in the preceding paper that didn't like that just established a limit model without central limit theory type result. We assume that agents use a public signal to coordinate on a pairwise stable equilibrium. So one way to think, one that could be implemented in practice, is that the public signal sets an initial state of the network, and then agents myopically adjust from there according to some protocol. So the set of pairwise stable networks does depend on attributes. It does depend on payoff shocks, and but we can also think of equilibrium select ways of modeling, describing, imposing restrictions on equilibrium selection that's separate from that. Okay, so
Konrad,
yeah,
if I may, so I think you quite correctly point out the potential difficulties in overburdening the agents in this. I guess any link that exists, any relationship that's established, I think it's reasonably uncontroversial to require something like the first part of the equilibrium definition. The second one is definitely very demanding epistemologically. It means that this tâtonnement process will have allowed me to sample potential relationships with pretty much everybody in the network, or that I know everybody on Facebook, for example, and have or have not established a link with them. Is it possible to go ahead just retaining the first part and dropping the second one? This is not going to make the multiplicity any better. It will complicate matters tremendously, but I wonder if the second part is required.
Yeah, that's a good so that's a good question. So the way I approached that before is to so one way to think about that problem realistically, like on Facebook or some other very large is that agents are not guaranteed to ever meet or consider each other, and that there is like some way to describe that meeting process. So you kind of have a two-stage model where in the first stage agents meet at random, then meet a large number of people at random, and then within conditional on like among those they meet, then you impose this constraint here. So you have like some exogenous meeting process before, and it is possible to kind of, so I did that like for in the matching paper. It is possible to incorporate that, like if it's like exogenous, like there's a way to write down such a process that doesn't complicate things too much. So essentially, like we'd send like the payoffs, we'd treat the model as if we set payoffs for links of agents that don't know about each other to minus infinity. Yeah,
I mean, I understand that something like this is necessary. I've used this concept as well, but it always bothered me that in large networks, you would need to pretty much know about the profitability of your relationship with anyone.
So you have to be able to, agents have to be able to evaluate their utility for each link, each potential link that there is. Like there's some constraints that you could work into this. So I mean, like, so the theory is just about, so I think that like the likelihood for the model, it comes only in at a very late stage. Like much of the theory is like, you know, independent of that. So I have like in the other paper, I also looked at some kind of sampling, endogenous sampling protocols where you just like, so you can still, like the theory is good, like the theory is useful to characterize events in terms of payoff inequalities given the network structure. So it may be, so I haven't thought this through, but it may be possible to have such an extension, but I'd have to think about it.
No, it's great to go on with a well accepted equilibrium concept. It's just that, you know, I guess one should be aware that it's going to essentially load all the links that don't exist there into preferences rather than constraints or environmental frictions. But
I mean, there is like an issue, like in terms of like, how do we interpret the non-links in the model? Like, I think one way or another, you'd probably have to take a stance on that, right? Like, otherwise you'd have only a likelihood for one of two outcomes at the link level. And so, yeah. Okay, so now the structure I imposed on those linked payoffs is that marginal costs does not depend on the target link. So I assume that anything that's specific to the target link is kind of subsumed with the benefits. And then I'm thinking of this model as like trying to stay as close as possible to kind of the way we write down parametric discrete choice models, and kind of I want to focus on the complications that come out of dependence rather than trying to keep this, make this as flexible as possible at this point. And I assume that the marginal benefit to forming a link from I to J, it depends on attributes, xi, xj. So for example, when we think of homophily, right, that could be, U star could be decreasing in the distance between components of xi and xj to each other, right? So if you have the same educational background, the same age, you live close to each other, you're more likely to be friends, something along these lines. But now what's kind of the part that makes the model kind of challenging is that network, like payoffs also should depend on network structure. And so here I assume that network structure enters only through some summary statistics that capture the absolute and relative positions of nodes I and J in the network. Okay, so SI is a statistic that captures the absolute position of node I in the network, for example, degree centrality. Think of other notions of centrality, though, like subsequent calculations might get more too involved for practicability. And Tij may capture something about the relative position of I and J to each other in the network in the absence of a direct link between the two. So for example, if there's a preference for triadic closure, right, then Tij could be an indicator for whether you have a friend in common, absent like a direct link between I and J. So whether you have like a network distance that's equal to 2 in the absence of a direct connection. Okay, so, and then there is an idiosyncratic taste shock, epsilon ij, that's assumed to be parametric, independent of everything else, and that's going to in part like help us also transform this large discrete problem into something that can be approximated by something that's continuous. And I just wanted to highlight like two parameters here that kind of pop out of nothing here but are important when we talk about the asymptotic sequence. So sigma is the scale of the taste shock, and we allow sigma to change in the asymptotic sequence. So that's it's more a technicality and why that may be necessary. So depending on the exact distribution of epsilon ij, the scale of the relevant statistic of those shocks may degenerate relative to the deterministic part. So we want to be able to control that separately. What's more important is the location of marginal costs. So log J. J is going to be, think of that as a number that's going to increase as n grows. That's essentially a way to enforce sparsity on the sequence. So I'm going to look at sparse sequences of networks, and log J is essentially increasing. The larger network gets, like, the fewer other links are potentially acceptable, and so that ensures that the network degree of the typical agent is stochastically bounded. So those are going to be choices, and that I have to justify independently, right? There are, in principle, arbitrarily many ways of embedding a finite cross-section into an asymptotic sequence, and I think for my purposes that these are so these are my preferred choices. Okay, and so I'm just going to give, like, yeah.
What about the marginal cost of G? Maybe I missed this. So what matters here is only I. I mean,
Yeah.
Is it important? I mean, the cost of the other agent, is it important here, like, to create the link?
Yeah, so this is a modeling choice, and it's essentially kind of premised on, assuming, like, if we had arbitrary flexibility in what we could put into Uij, right, then that would not be a constraint, because, I could just have Uij, redefine Uij as the true marginal benefit minus the true marginal cost, and then just set marginal costs to 0. So in a sense, like, for a full characterization of payoff inequalities, I only have to specify the difference. And so this is kind of just a question of what do I put on one side of the difference versus the other. But of course, together with, like, all the structure separability and so forth that I impose here, that's going to have bite.
Okay, thank you.
And so the reason I approach it this way is like, technical convenience when we get so that this gives us, this helps us get, like, more useful approximations. So the main assumptions I impose here are that the systematic parts are bounded. There might be a version of the theory where you have, like, some other, like, I don't know, L2 or other bound on those. This is just making the theory more. So it's going to be complicated enough in other aspects that I just want to keep this part simple. One important implication of this is kind of, it has like a qualitative effect of how we should think about, like, spatial dependence in the graph. So one way to think about space in this network formation model is that space is part of the attributes. So and there's an application in the previous paper that doesn't, so like the at health high school kids, like, there's a data set where they report the GPS coordinates where they actually live, and if you live close to somebody else in your high school, like, it's easier for you to, like, socialize outside of class. You might be on the same school bus home. You are more likely to have been zoned for the same primary and middle school. So there are many reasons, right, why the space might matter here. By bounding the effect of space means that we can't have kind of expanding, we can't think of this as expanding domain asymptotic. So this is kind of going to be fixed domain asymptotics. And one way, I like to use the term infill asymptotics, even though like it's usually used like in different literatures in very specific ways that don't quite match this here. But we can think of this as, if we think of this as a spatial model, we just add more and more agents to an existing space, an existing set of locations. So if you think of the high school, right, like if you live at the opposite end of the school district, you still meet the kid in school. You still meet, you know, a kid at after school sports activity. So it's not like it's like prohibitively expensive for you to be friends with that person. You're somewhat less likely, but it's a matter of degree, right? So you treat like any of those forcing variables, the effect of any of those forcing variables in X as a matter of degree rather than like an absolute constraint. And so for the idiosyncratic, so the important restriction so that I want to highlight here is independence. And so it's independence conditional on F. And so that's a restriction on equilibrium selection that equilibrium selection effectively is constrained not to depend on payoff shocks. The previous paper didn't need that, but it's like going to be hard. Like, so the problem is essentially, you know, how can we derive like a central limit theory type result if we have like selection among equilibria that can like jump around in an uncontrolled way, depending on payoff shocks. Like say I could allow, otherwise I could allow payoff equilibrium selection to depend on payoff realization for one specific agent. At least for the current iteration of this project, like that's maybe too challenging to deal with. Another, and this is kind of an aspect that I'm not going to highlight too much in this talk today. I also assume that the payoff shocks are in the domain of attraction of extreme value type 1 distribution. So the reason we talk about extreme value properties matter here is that under those sparse asymptotics, you need to have like a very favorable idiosyncratic taste shock draw for any link that comes even under close consideration. So any of the payoff shocks that are relevant for probabilities in the limit depend on realizations of epsilon ij that are like far out in the right tail of the distribution. Okay, and so it doesn't like matter much what the shape of the distribution is around the median or any like finite percentile, but the shape of the tails. And so so that's kind of where that comes in.
So, Konrad, so if I can think about the idiosyncratic shocks as extreme value type 1, just for simplicity here, I guess that's more or less the spirit of the assumption here. Could I do away with the IID-ness and look at something like generalized extreme values?
Yeah. So here I'm really going to use independence here. Well, I'm going to use independence. So you could have so independence between agent I's taste shocks and agent J's taste shocks. If you had some dependence among agent I, so like some nesting structure.
Right, yeah. So
I could,
if I get a big draw on my epsilon to link with you, that may be correlated with my epsilon to link with Mingli.
Yeah, So
our vectors may be independent.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't see like a reason why that one could show right away that that's impossible. Like the way I prefer to think about dependence and, you know, like violations of IIA here is that for the purposes of this part here, the xi's and xj's need not all to be observed. So we could allow for like some like random coefficients in here. We could allow for some unobserved heterogeneity in the X part as well to have like more flexible patterns, but yeah, but yeah, a good point. Yeah. So now the kind of target of approximation here are network moments. So network moments are, for the purposes of this paper, polyadic averages of functions. So like the way to think about it is that, I'm interested in network moments among triads of nodes, then I can average over all combinations of 3 distinct nodes in the network. And then I can evaluate whether a certain event about the subnetwork among those agents holds true. So that's this indicator here. And I can also interact that with some function of covariance. So here it's a bolt script I index. So that's a multi-index. So it might depend on the characteristics of any nodes in that among those D nodes that I'm evaluating here, right? And so this is like, so in general, like one could look only at pairwise, like dyadic averages, like what's like the share of links that form that have like where agents are close to each other in terms of characteristics. But for certain strategic and aspects, like identification may come from like higher order interactions. So I might have to consider larger groups of agents. And so kind of the difficulty with evaluating those moments is that the conditional probability of the subnetwork being of a certain form can't be evaluated in isolation because it's, the pairwise stable network forms globally. And so that any triad interacts with the rest of the network. And so that's kind of what the paper is mainly about, is to understand how those local dyads, polyads interact with a larger network where we can like simplify the representation for how that dependence operates, and then finding so in practice for finite n, I will not be able to evaluate this probability exactly, but then kind of the claim and the result of the paper is that I can, under looking at the network under certain asymptotic sequences, I can derive a limit of mn star, m naught star, that can be characterized more convenient. It's still not going to be like, unless you look at very simple special cases, this is also not necessarily going to be closed form, right? But you get like greatly simplified representations of this. Okay, and so of course, the problem is like, what's like the right way to embed, like define an asymptotic sequence around a given cross-section, like around a given network with n players, and that's to some extent arbitrary. So asymptotics here is not about like an empirical description of what is going to happen to a real network. What's going to happen to Facebook if we go from 5 billion to 10 billion agents, including Martians, or I don't know, but it's about because that's like the data set is just the finite cross-section at n, but the asymptotic sequence, the asymptotic experiment, serves as an approximation device. It's like saying that we, if n is large enough, this approximation is close enough, and we know that we have to therefore be careful in kind of what qualitative features the limit retains. So any asymptotic distribution is degenerate in some important sense. So we have to also make sure that the limit remains non-degenerate in the aspects that matter for the model. And so kind of here, the qualitative features that we want to retain in this model are sparsity, or like that bounded network degree, and or bound degree centrality, and we want to balance the relative importance of systematic and idiosyncratic parts. And so that pins down the rates for J and sigma in this particular so they're not needed. So sigma and J are not necessarily held fixed, but they're adjusted to kind of make sure that the limit faithfully kind of replicates those qualitative features of the finite cross-section. So yeah, like here, the exact choice for the sequence of sigma, that's kind of depends on the shape of the tail of the distribution of payoff shocks. So if you're logit, then sigma can just stay at equal to 1 or whatever normalization we choose, and with no need to change anything. But like normal tails are very thin, so we have to kind of boost the scale of a normal taste shock in order for that to go through. Okay, and then we can, like in broad terms, think of the asymptotic approximation as describing the finite n model, the finite n moment, evaluated in the realized network among n agents as its expectation in the limit, plus an error that's going to be stochastic. So why is the approximation error stochastic? Well, the sampling experiment that we consider here is that the network is formed by n agents that are drawn at random from some meta population. So so the agents, the specific n agents that we have here with their attributes and with their taste shocks are random draws, and that's why the finite n network and the realized moment is random. And so the result of this paper is that, so the previous paper just derived m naught of theta, kind of a way to link the expectation of that moment to model primitives. And now the contribution of this paper is to characterize the leading term of the approximation error and show that this is in fact normally distributed, asymptotically normal. Okay, and so that's like in a nutshell, the result. And so that also means that we can use that result for inference. Like we can think of the uncertainty in compare. So if we knew, if somebody told us the true moment m0 of theta, then that would contain all the identifying information about any payoff or other parameters, and we could just invert that out. Like if we invert it out, it could be a point or it could be a set, right? Depending on the nature of identification in this problem. But the relevant sampling uncertainty under this experiment of like drawing agents from a population and then sticking n of them together to form the network, that's like the relevant uncertainty for inference, right? Okay. And any questions about this part?
I think there's no question in the chat, so.
Okay. Yeah. Good. So and so kind of now the question is like, what's like the overall structure? What's the structure of dependence here, and how is that addressed in the paper? And so we won't have time, so it won't be time to really go into details about that. But essentially, the structure of the argument is that so if you think of the problem in terms of exchangeability, which is not a correct description of this model, then we know by De Finetti's theorem or Aldous-Hoover representations, depending on kind of what order of moments we look at, we can think of them without loss of generality as conditionally independent increments, right? Given possibly like a global aggregate random shock. And so here we have a parametric model. And so essentially our asymptotic arguments identify what the remaining aggregate sources of dependence are to an approximation. So, why doesn't exchangeability apply directly on the finite agent version of the model? Well, exchangeability is a concept about an infinite sequence, right? It means that we could permute agent n-1 with agent n+1 and leave the distribution unchanged. Now here, it's only the first n agents that together form an equilibrium of sorts, right? And so if we switch agent n-1 for agent n+1, it may completely change the equilibrium set, like the old equilibrium, or nothing close to it may still be feasible. And so in that sense, this representation is not exact. And kind of the difficult part of the argument is to establish a way to describe the problem to approximate the problem by something that's actually exchangeable, right? And so the way that's solved here is that we think of this aggregate state variables as a parameter that's like determined endogenously in the model. And so we can write down the moment as we vary the parameter for it. We can evaluate that moment in this approximating model for any value of the parameter. But then we also have to account for the fact that that parameter is determined in equilibrium among those n agents. And that's kind of what unconditionally creates that dependence. And so we can stack the moments of interest with the moments that determine that correspond to the equilibrium condition for eta hat. And so that's kind of in a nutshell the argument. And for the approximating moment then is truly exchangeable given the aggregate variables that capture the nature of equilibrium among the n agents. So, but then, and this idea is kind of like built on an earlier paper of mine about large discrete games where interaction was explicitly modeled as depending on some aggregate state, like the average, like say the fraction of, you have like a social, you have like a social interactions model where like kids base their decision whether to smoke on like what fraction of their classmates smokes. That in that case, the interaction is explicitly channeled through the fraction of kids in the classroom. That fraction is endogenously determined. It's like an equilibrium outcome of the model, but you have like an aggregate state variables that completely captures dependence. So that's not going to be the case here. And that's like what makes the problem so challenging. Like here, those spillover effects, like characterize strategic dependence that might work indirectly through like long chains of adjustments. They're not exactly like that. There's no aggregate state variable in the finite n player model for which that would be exactly true. And so the contribution and the challenge of the approximation argument is to propose aggregate state variables that describe a limiting model and showing that this limiting model is a good approximation to the finite. So it's kind of like an as-if aggregate state variable, an as-if strategic variable that is faced by all the players in the same way.
So, Konrad, if I may, just one question. I'm not sure if maybe I'm not getting the whole picture correctly, but so you have this exchangeability conditional on eta, if I gather what you just said, and you're going to have sparsity. I presume this eta captures something about the equilibrium that's being selected. My recollection is that there is a tension between sparsity and exchangeability typically in these settings. How does this get resolved here?
Yeah, so here so we're not using any results about exchangeability. So exchangeability is just like, I want to think of it as kind of like an idea of how we can organize dependency. We have some kind of symmetric dependence. And so the structure of this problem mirrors exchangeability. It's not about exchangeability itself, right? So the approximating model is kind of the structure of the approximating model is that we can think of this. So we extract like our polyad, like our 3 nodes, say, from the network, and we look at it unconditionally, like what's the conditionally on the equilibrium selection, what's the probability that I see those 3 nodes like fully connected. Then that depends, right? That depends on how each of these 3 nodes connects to the rest of the network, because there might be other kinds of interdependence, right? Like, so for example, 2 nodes on an edge may have a common neighbor in common with somebody who's outside of that triad. And so now to an approximation, we can think of that problem as just drawing those 3 nodes and then drawing network neighborhoods from a different data generating process. In this case, it's going to be a Poisson process that draws a certain number depending on kind of availability, and that's endogenously determined. It respects like availability and with certain attributes and with certain endogenous values for the endogenous network variables. And so these are the distribution, the relative frequency of those endogenous values of the endogenous network variables. That's an equilibrium object, right? So we can think of the problem as, while the exact value of those network statistics for this draw, why that's a random variable that's like drawn, like the distribution of it from which it is generated, the intensity, Poisson intensity at which nodes of certain types, certain endogenous plus exogenous types are drawn, are put around that network neighborhood, that is something that's determined in equilibrium, and that's determined globally in equilibrium. That's depends just on like the relative, frequency of those, or the conditional frequency of those network variables given attributes in the network at large. And so kind of that's kind of what, so the challenge of the exact finite end player model is that we have blocking chains. Like if I choose to break a link to somebody I'm currently connected with, that's going to change that other person's network position. In turn, like there are going to be subsequent adjustments, and there could be like a finite length cycle of subsequent adjustments that make like another connection in my network neighborhood no longer pairwise stable. Okay, and so with this approximating argument, it essentially breaks that into, that depends into 2 levels. It takes out like there can be interdependence locally, like where, yeah, if I add like another link, then of course I increase my network degree, and I only need to understand the effect, the direct effect of this on my immediate network neighborhood, and ignore the indirect effects. And like any indirect effects get channeled only through this aggregate state variable. So that's all the asymptotically, like all the subgroups of agents interact only globally through those shared aggregate state variables, and then everything else can be local, modeled as local dependence. And so so we take a bit of a ramp up to kind of motivate like where those 2 state variables come from. So this Availability comes like from the extreme value kind of logit type model, like you characterize a choice set by the inclusive value, and the reference distribution comes from looking at like at what frequency do the relevant subnetworks like form, you know, nodes, support nodes having a certain network degree, certain triads completing, and so forth. And so once that's all in place, then once we can,
Sorry, so you have about 5 minutes?
Yeah.
5 minutes? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So let me just give like a quick description of like the main argument, and then I want to say like maybe like 2 minutes like on I have some data I want to talk about. Okay. So once we can think of this like the what captures that dependence as a parameter that has like just has to satisfy additional moment conditions, then you know, I draw those, get those Poisson draws for those neighborhoods. I can think of them as generated independently across dyads. So this has like that exchangeable at that level. This is a partially exchangeable array. I can use the representation theorems, and then I can think of the local outcome among those D nodes as a function of an unknown function of node level shocks, edge level shocks, and polyet level shocks, which are all without loss of generality, independent IID uniform. And then I can use like a Hofting decomposition of the moments, where I essentially project first onto the node level shocks, then on pairs of node level shocks and edge level shocks, and so on and so forth. And then I just have to determine, so these are, if all of those terms have non-negligible variance, then they're like ordered in orders of magnitude, you know, by the leading terms. So if I can show that this term is non-degenerate, then that's going to be, the other terms are going to be dominated by that. And then the result comes like from kind of from martingale CLT for this first term. And that's effectively what happens with like the caveat that we have to account for those equilibrium conditions for this nuisance parameter. So this is like essentially, we can think of this as analogous to GMM with an estimated nuisance parameter, where we derive the asymptotic distribution by stacking the moment conditions for this auxiliary parameter. And so there's an empirical application in progress for this. Maybe before are there any questions about this?
There's one, but we can actually leave it for the Q&A. So if you want to quickly kind of go through this and head towards the conclusion, I can ask the question in the Q&A.
Yeah. So I have a data set from an economic historian at Stern, Petra Moser. It's about applicants to the New York Stock Exchange in the early 1900s. So essentially, that is like a massive trust game. Like if you trade on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, everybody has to trust their counterparties that they meet on the floor. There's no electronic technology to like keep track of trades. At the end of the day, you know, prices go up and down. Everybody balances their books, and you have to trust the other party to acknowledge like any informal agreements that have been made. So in order to be admitted to the New York Stock Exchange, you had to be approved by a committee of like 16 like leading members of the New York Stock Exchange. And you had to provide 2 sponsors for your application, who are usually like prominent, well-regarded people in the New York world of finance. And so like an interesting aspect of that network was that there is like an ethnic component to it. So you had an Anglo-Saxon network of bankers like the Morgans and the Stanleys, and then you had a German Jewish network, like the Lehman Brothers, for example. And there is like a lot of anecdotal evidence that those communities, so there were like central people in those communities managed to bridge like the gap to others, but that a lot of activity was taking place inside those. And so the question is, by the sponsor agreeing to vouch for your integrity, and by you like, being able to, choosing those sponsors, like what is it that establishes that trust between you as the applicant and the committee? And so it's kind of like, has like some flavor of that, of those structures, the literature on structural holes in network. So we have data on like 4,000 applicants. We can observe like whether they were approved or not, like the number of white and black balls. Most of them were approved because applicants anticipate like who might be like a workable set of references for that. And so I kind of allow for latent positions for those agents. So like the XIs, parts of the XI/XJ is like here, like a two-dimensional like latent space. So you also want to see like how the agents are located in those in that latent space. So you can, the nodes are coded by ethnic group, and you can see that there is some underlying there's like some underlying sorting with like the reds like grouped up here. The blues are a much bigger group, like more heterogeneous group. And so ultimately, so this is like still in progress. So ultimately, this is a question about kind of what kind of strategically, like what's kind of the social, what determines that social trust or capital beyond just like like bilateral relations. Like, is it if you provide like two sponsors who are like virtually indistinguishable, like from the same community, from the same area of the latent space, is that a working strategy with the committee, or do you have to find people who really like bridge the gap between you and the committee members? Okay, and so hopefully I'll have like some more interesting empirical results on that soon. And that concludes my talk.
Hey, Konrad, thanks. Let me stop the recording first.